Feller told me one time they got a weed down here and they call it a loco weed. When the horses and cows eat it, they get wilder and all get out.
A boy stands at his father's funeral and slowly realizes something painful. The people around him aren't crying for the man he lost. They're mourning a character. At just 14, that truth hits hard. That boy is Dirk Blocker. For the world, it was the death of a TV legend. For Dirk, it was the end of his childhood. His father was Dan Blocker, remembered by millions as the gentle giant Hoss Cartwright from Bonanza. On screen, Dan looked strong and unbreakable. But behind the cameras, there was pressure, exhaustion, and quiet struggles. When Dan died suddenly, the world lost an actor, but a son lost his father. For nearly 50 years, Dirk stayed silent. Now, at 67, he is finally speaking, not just about fame, but about the hidden price it takes from families. Long before fame, Dan was a boy who grew up too fast, learning early how to carry loss in silence. That silence passed from father to son. And to understand why Dirk stayed quiet for so long, we must first understand the man his father once was. Because that's where the real story begins. Dan Blocker did not have an easy beginning. He was born in 1928 in a small town in Texas, a place where nothing was forgotten, and everyone remembered everything. From the moment he entered the world, he stood out. He was unusually large at birth, so much so that people talked about it for years. But size was only the surface of his story. Before Dan could truly understand what life was, loss entered his home. When he was only 5 years old, his older sister died from pneumonia. There was no long goodbye, no explanation a child could understand. One day she was there, and the next day she was gone. The house changed overnight. Laughter faded. Silence settled in. Childhood, as Dan knew it, quietly ended. Soon after that loss, the family moved to a small farming town. Life there was not gentle. It demanded work, and it demanded it early. Dan was still a child, but his days looked nothing like other children's. After school, he worked behind a grocery store, lifted heavy sacks, and helped grown men with jobs meant for adults. People did not see a boy learning life. They saw a body built for labor. Dan grew fast. Too fast. By the age of 10, he looked older than his years. By 13, he worked side by side with men in their 20s. Some people admired his strength. Others were uneasy around it. But very few tried to understand the person inside it. Being different made him noticeable, but it also made him alone. What many never noticed was how quiet Dan was. He did not speak much. He watched. He listened. He learned how people reacted to his size before they ever listened to his words. He understood early that being different often meant being judged first and understood later, if at all. That lesson stayed with him. His parents worried, not because Dan was weak, but because he was too strong for his age. They feared his size would shape his future in ways he could not control. Hoping discipline could guide him, they sent him to military school. There, Dan learned structure, order, and restraint. He learned how to follow rules, how to control his strength, and how to carry responsibility. More importantly, he learned how to carry weight on the inside. He learned how to hold pain quietly, how to stay calm even when life felt heavy. That emotional control became part of who he was. The darkness from his early years did not disappear. It settled into him. Years later, when audiences saw Dan Blocker smiling on television, they saw confidence and strength, They saw a gentle giant who seemed comfortable in his skin. What they did not see was the boy who had grown up too fast. They did not see the early losses, the hard work, or the loneliness. They saw the strength. They never saw the cost of building it. By the time Dan Blocker became a young man, the world was already changing, and war arrived without asking who was ready. Dan joined the United States Army not for glory or praise, but because duty called. Training was hard, but nothing prepared him for what came next. Cold nights, mud, fear, and long hours of waiting became normal. Waiting for orders, waiting for danger, waiting to see who would not return. During the Korean War, Dan was sent overseas, where tension filled the days and silence filled the nights. He learned something quickly. Panic gets you killed. So he stayed calm, not because he was fearless, but because fear became familiar. His size made him stand out, but his calm made others follow him. He carried wounded soldiers, helped guide men through perilous situations, and remained steady when everything fell apart. Over time, he was promoted, not because he spoke loudly, but because he stayed focused. War changed him, not into an angry man, but into a controlled one, not into violence, but into silence. When the war ended and Dan came home, he was not the same person. He spoke less, smiled less, and carried something heavy inside. People saw a strong man return, but they never saw what stayed behind his eyes. The war taught him how to hold pain, how to protect others, and how to remain gentle even after seeing darkness. This was the man who returned to civilian life. Calm, disciplined, deeply reserved. Later, when millions watched him on television and called him kind and gentle, they never knew that this gentleness was learned in a place where kindness was rare. This quiet strength would soon become the heart of the character America would fall in love with. When the war ended, Dan Blocker did not run toward fame or chase attention. What he wanted was quiet, control, and a normal life. He went back to school and studied drama and speech, not because he wanted to be famous, but because the stage felt safe. There were no guns, no shouted orders, no fear of dying, only stories and structure. At first, Dan stayed in the background, moving props, carrying heavy equipment, and helping other actors shine. That was enough for him. Still, people noticed him, not just because of his size, but because of his calm and steady presence. Teachers saw it, classmates felt it. Dan didn't talk much. He listened and observed. Fame was never his goal. He dreamed of teaching, earning a PhD, and standing in classrooms, not in front of cameras. Everything changed unexpectedly during a simple family trip to Hollywood. Dan was standing on a sidewalk, dressed in cowboy clothes with boots and a wide hat. He wasn't looking for work or trying to be noticed, but a talent agent saw him. There was no audition, no script, no test, just one look that changed his life. Small roles followed first: bartenders, soldiers, men with only a few lines. The pay was low, the hours long, and Dan told himself it was only temporary, just a way to support his family. Then came Bonanza. At first, it didn't feel special. Just another Western, another ranch, another role. Dan was cast as Hoss Cartwright, written simply as muscle and nothing more. But Dan played him differently, adding kindness, patience, and a quiet heart that viewers immediately felt. Week after week, the show grew. Ratings climbed, families tuned in every Sunday, and fame arrived. Not slowly or gently, but all at once. Fans followed him, Crowds waited outside studios, and privacy disappeared. Dan was no longer just a man. He became a symbol, the gentle giant. Behind the smile, the cost was heavy. 14-hour days, 6 days a week, more than 30 episodes a year, extreme heat, heavy costumes, horses, and stunts all took a toll on his body. At home, his children waited as birthdays were missed, dinners were skipped, and quiet moments disappeared. Dan once admitted he saw his TV family more than his real one. Fame brought success and security, but slowly and quietly, it took his time, his health, and his dreams. The Ph.D. never happened. Teaching faded away, and books were replaced by scripts. Bonanza became #1. Millions loved Hoss Cartwright, but few ever asked what it truly cost to be him. Dan kept smiling, kept working, and stayed kind, even when pain felt normal and exhaustion followed him home. The world believed fame made him strong, but the darker truth was simpler. Strength was what fame demanded from him every single day. By the time Bonanza reached the top, Dan Blocker was already paying a heavy price. The show was a massive success, with millions watching every week. But success did not bring rest. The work never slowed down. 14-hour days became normal. 6 days a week became expected, and more than 30 episodes were filmed every year with no real breaks. Dan worked under hot lights, wore heavy costumes, rode horses, and performed demanding stunts repeatedly. His body was not built for this kind of pace, but he never said no. Pain became part of his routine. He felt tired most of the time, his joints hurt, and breathing was not always easy, yet he continued to show up. People around him noticed the changes, but Dan laughed it off and said he was fine. At home, the cost was clearer. He missed dinners, birthdays, and quiet nights. Sometimes he came home so exhausted that he barely spoke. His children saw him less, even though he lived under the same roof. Dan once admitted something painful, that he spent more time with his television family than with his real one, and that truth stayed with him. Before Bonanza, Dan had other dreams. He wanted to teach. He wanted to finish his studies. He wanted a Ph.D. Those dreams never disappeared. They only became quiet. Books were replaced by scripts, classrooms by studio sets, and he kept telling himself that one day he would return to them. But that day never came. As the years passed, his health continued to decline. He gained weight, his body struggled to keep up, and doctors warned him to slow down, but rest felt impossible. The show depended on him, and fans depended on him, and Dan carried that responsibility without complaint. Behind the scenes, pressure was constant, with long shoots, little sleep, and high expectations. The gentle giant had no space to appear weak. By the early 1970s, something was clearly wrong. Dan suffered ongoing pain, especially in his stomach, but he did not talk about it much. He believed in pushing through, the way soldiers and strong men always had. In 1972, doctors said he needed gallbladder surgery. It sounded routine and simple, nothing to worry about. Dan told his family he would be back soon. No one expected what followed. After the operation, a blood clot formed and traveled to his lungs. Dan could not breathe. Doctors rushed and nurses ran, but it was too late. On May 13, 1972, Dan Blocker died. He was only 43 years old. The news shocked the country. Fans could not imagine Bonanza without Hoss. But at home, the loss was deeper. A wife lost her husband, and 4 children lost their father. One of them was only 14. To the world, Dan Blocker was a television icon. To his family, he was simply gone. The gentle giant who carried everything for everyone else could not carry this. And in that moment, the true cost of strength finally became clear. When Dirk Blocker lost his father, the world kept moving, even though his life stopped. He was only 14, too young to understand death, and too young to carry a famous last name alone. One day his father was there, steady and familiar. The next day he was gone, taken by what everyone called a routine surgery. There was no warning, no slow goodbye, no time to prepare. It felt unreal, like a bad dream that should have ended, but never did. Inside the house, everything became quiet. Outside, everything grew louder. News spread fast. Fans were shocked. People talked about Bonanza, about Hoss Cartwright, about what the show would do next. Very few talked about the boy who had just lost his father. At the funeral, strangers cried and cameras waited while Dirk tried to understand how his father could belong to the whole world and still be gone from him. From that moment, childhood ended. Grief came as confusion and silence, not clear answers. Dirk learned early that when your parent is famous, your pain is often invisible. People assumed he would be fine because his father was loved and celebrated. But public love does not replace a father at home. School felt different. Friends did not know what to say. Adults spoke softly, then moved on. So Dirk stopped talking. It felt easier to stay quiet than to explain something no one could fix. As years passed, the loss stayed. Dirk grew up with 2 versions of his father. One was the gentle giant the world remembered forever on television. The other was the man who came home tired, laughed quietly, and lived in small, private moments. That split never healed. It shaped who Dirk became. He did not chase fame or attention. When he chose acting later, it was careful and quiet, never loud, never center stage. This was not just the day Dan Blocker died. It was the day Dirk Blocker had to grow up, without knowing how. For many years, Dirk Blocker lived quietly inside his father's shadow. He carried a famous last name, but he did not try to live loudly because of it. He learned early that fame takes more than it gives, and he chose a different path. When he became an actor, he did it slowly, taking smaller roles and staying out of the spotlight. He wanted to be known for his work, not for who his father was. Over time, Dirk built a career that felt right to him. It was steady, not flashy. Years later, a new generation discovered him on television, not as the son of a legend, but as his own person. That mattered to him. He had finally found space to breathe. His father, Dan Blocker, remained frozen in time for the world. Forever strong, forever kind, forever Hoss Cartwright. But for Dirk, his father was something else. He was the man who came home tired, the man who laughed softly, the man who was gone too soon. As Dirk grew older, the pain did not disappear, but it softened. Silence turned into understanding. Grief turned into memory. He began to speak not to relive the loss, but to honor it. Not to chase sympathy, but to tell the truth. This story is not about fame. It is about what remains after fame fades. A father, a son, and the quiet strength it takes to live with both love and loss. That is the legacy that truly lasts.